A heartfelt appreciation to foppery and whim for granting permission to narrate the story. Be sure to find their details in the description below. Without further ado, let's delve into the tale. Eileen guided his horse across the dirt roads of the small hamlet of Micah's Ford, his soldiers trailing after him. As he passed the homes and storefronts of the village, he made sure to smile out his greeting to a few of the residents who had stopped their work to gaze at the train of soldiers picking their way through the streets. But 3 years stationed on the border of the Rosewater Kingdom, fending off raids and assaults from displaced tribes, had turned Eilin's smile into a disturbing thing. When he noticed the townsfolk shying away from him, he sighed in resignation and kept his eyes down as he headed to the outskirts of the village. Traveling through the village was a somewhat jarring experience for Eileen. He could count on one hand the number of villages he'd been in over the past few years, and all of those had either been burnt out, husks with little that remained to identify them as once prosperous villages, or collections of buildings that had been turned into outposts for the Rosewater Kingdom's military, still sporting the collection of scars that told the tale of the raids from outside tribes. Ever since the wood elves of the Ulhelm Forest had united under a single ruler, consolidated their territory, and subsumed most of their neighboring forest tribes, more and more raids had struck at the southern border of the kingdom. The few beastfolk tribes that refused to bend the knee to the wood elves, but weren't strong enough to keep control over their territory, were forced to range far from the confines of Ulhelm, and thus butted against the border of the kingdom. At the outskirts of Micah's Ford, Eileen came to a clearing filled with a large cabin. 2 humans stood outside next to a strung-up body of a periton, a deer-like creature with the wings and hindquarters of an eagle. The cabin's garden stretched through the clearing and wrapped around the house. A small pond to the right gave off a faint glow of purple, and Eileen could hear the splashing of fish and water lapping at the rocks decorating its border. The periton hung from metal hooks next to the table in front of the cabin. A small wooden bowl on the ground collected the blood that poured from its cut neck, and a man and little girl stood behind the creature, seeming to give no notice to the Rosewater soldiers tramping up to the cabin. Lynn had difficulties telling the age of humans, but he guessed that the man was approaching middle age. His close-cropped black hair was peppered with strands of white, and small crinkles were barely visible around his eyes. The gray linen shirt he wore was pushed up to his elbows, showing off forearms covered in a bevy of scars and burn marks. His arms bragged of a wiry strength, and his presence seemed natural in the clearing. Surrounded by plants and the strung-up periton, Eileen caught the man looking at the approaching soldiers briefly before turning back to the girl and pointing out specific areas on the hanging creature. As she listened, her face fell into a stony, determined silence. She was probably still too young to be considered an adult by human standards. Her short brown hair stuck out wildly from her head, and a look of intense concentration radiated from her features. Eileen cleared his throat, attempting to draw the man's attention. "Are you Master Alric Simeon?" An affirmative grunt was all the man returned as he kept his attention glued to the young girl, continuing his gestures towards the deer-like creature. "I have a letter from the king," said Eileen as he stretched out a thick, rich white envelope. "King?" asked the man. "Don't have one. How dare you?" started one of Eileen's soldiers before being cut off by a sergeant who cuffed him upside his head and glared him down. Eileen was grateful for the sergeant's quick thinking. The king had warned him when he'd accepted this mission that Master Simeon was a proud man. He couldn't be threatened or cowed into working for the kingdom, and something as vague and ambiguous as patriotism would be simply brushed aside. But humans had a unique talent the king was in desperate need of, and Master Simeon needed to be shown the proper respect. King Regans is hoping to offer Master Simeon a job. He detailed it all out in this letter. If you'd kindly read it, I would be eternally grateful. The king said he would consider it a personal favor. His Master Simeon accepted this job. Eileen could hear quiet gasps escape from the soldiers as they understood the price of what the king was offering. A personal favor of a ruler was a great thing, and to offer it to a simple man at the crossroads of nowhere, and who the hell knows, was unheard of. Of course, Eileen had been assured that the offer of a favor was real, but was meant more to grab Master Simeon's attention. The man would most likely never cash in the favor. instead viewing the offer as the sign of respect it was intended as. The man gave Elend a long look before stepping away from the peryton and grabbing the letter. As he broke the seal and began reading through the contents, he threw a "I don't hear working" over his shoulder. That statement jolted the young girl into action, and she quickly began carving into the peryton, easily separating the meat into finely cut segments and wrapping them in brown paper. Master Simeon read through the letter, paused a moment to think, then turned on his heel and disappeared into the cabin. Elend could feel the shock and anger radiating from his soldiers, but was thankful they weren't foolish enough to catch his attention. While his soldiers stewed at the lack of respect shown by the human, Elend waited patiently. Humans were neither numerous nor dominant in the Rosewater Kingdom. While Elend had heard tales of humans on other continents and the armies they fielded, the art they created, and the technology they wielded to most denizens of the Rosewater Kingdom, humans were viewed as generalists. Their wide skill sets and disparate talents allowed them to become proficient in most things they turned their minds to, but they rarely ever approached the true mastery exhibited by other races in their chosen field. Dwarves were excellent miners, gnomes could tinker, goblins could blow things up, Oni and Tengu were some of the finest military masters a kingdom could ask for. Humans were fine, at least that was the prevailing wisdom of the majority of the kingdom. But Elend was part of the elite few who knew better. A small group of people on the continent were aware of the unique talents humans rarely showed in mixed company, a talent that was worth enough for the king to send a troop of elite soldiers to the back end of nowhere to beg a human with the offer of a personal favor. If swallowing his pride and begging Master Simeon for help could save his kingdom years of warfare and death, and the king and his counselors were in agreement it could, then Elend would do what was necessary. Moments after disappearing into his cabin, Alaric Simeon came out clutching a large paper map in his hands and shrugging on a small leather satchel. A dozen knives of differing shapes and styles decorated the sheaths that sat snug on his thighs, and his gray linen shirt had been covered by a thick canvas jacket. He spread the map out on the table in front of the cabin and placed the king's letter down next to it. Elend could pick out the two hand-drawn portraits that had been enclosed with the letter, portraits showing a young elf boy and young elf girl. Elend watched as Master Simeon traced a complicated route on the map from Mika's Ford up to the capital of the kingdom, made several small markings on the map, and then stood up to think. Finally, he burst into action. Withdrawing a small leather-clad journal from his bag, he wrote furiously before ripping out the page and setting it on the table. He packed up the map, the king's letter, and the portraits of the two elves, and slipped them into his bag along with a generous cut of meat from the peryton. "It'll take me 5 days to reach the capital," announced Master Simeon as he checked over his equipment. Elend knew that he and his soldiers could make the trip faster, but he wasn't about to press the man on what he needed the additional time for. Shouldering his bag and completing a last check through his gear, Master Simeon turned to the young girl who was still in the process of dressing the peryton. "I left a list of items you'll need to bring with you. These men will see you safely to the capital." Almost as an afterthought, Master Simeon added, "When you're done packing up, feed them." And then he was away. The knot of worry that had bothered Elend since accepting the mission began easing as he watched Master Simeon slip into the forest. Elend had accomplished what he set out to do, and after taking the measure of the man, knew that the kingdom had been saved. He ignored the small grumblings coming from his soldiers over the impertinence of the human and got off his horse. Giving the young girl a wide smile he hoped showed his good intentions, Elend began clearing the table in preparation for a feast. Maybe later, he'd explain to his soldiers why they were celebrating. He could tell them about the satchel that Master Simeon wore and how it was made from Bulbara leather, something only a few craftsmen in the kingdom had the skills to work with. The only reason to use Bulbara leather was to make a 4D satchel, a bag capable of holding nearly limitless weight while keeping everything inside in a state of suspended animation. Bags like that were worth more than the entirety of Mika's Ford. He could tell his soldiers about the numerous plants and herbs in the surrounding garden. Most were common enough to be found in any kitchen, house, or inn throughout the kingdom. But a few of the plants were truly rare and unique. He had noticed one, the elmsberry, that was a medicinal plant, famed for its ability to regrow limbs. A single bud of elmsberry cost more than what most soldiers made in a month, and there were 4 fully grown plants in front of the small cabin. He could explain the mystery that gripped him when he first rode up to the cabin, the small pond. He had heard the sounds of waves lapping against the rocks that circled the pond, but ponds didn't normally generate waves. The mystery was solved when Elind saw Master Simeon grab a handful of sea salt from the pond before he left, and Elind realized that the human had somehow managed to create a small, self-contained sea in his front yard. He could explain the significance of the periton that he and the rest of his soldiers were about to feast on. There were more dangerous, and thus, more well-known creatures in the surrounding forest. But few were more sought after by hunters than the periton. Its subconscious understanding of its home forest, combined with its ability to fly and natural agility in wooded areas, made the periton a deceptively difficult creature to pin down. It was rare to find a hunter skilled enough to take down a periton, making its meat and lether highly prized among merchants. Maybe he'd tell his soldiers about the knives jammed into Master Simeon's sheaths and how they all bore the stylized PR silver mark on their handles. That silver mark signified them as the work of the famous orc blacksmith, Purnell Rivers, whose weapons were famed throughout the land. Several poems and ballads had been written about the weapons forged by the blacksmith, including a few about the sword the current king wielded. Ellen knew that a man who was paid with a favor from the king, wearing a Bulbara satchel, carrying knives bearing a PR silver mark, and capable of taking down a periton, could easily accomplish the mission the king offered. And as celebration of that knowledge, Elind grabbed some wineskins from his saddlebags and got ready to eat. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and wants to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. And for every comment that comments heart, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.